Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Toxikk for PC. This is a first-person arena shooter by Reactor Studios that was released out of early access on September 10th. Before then it was, I believe, about 20 months in early access. But now the full version of the game is finally upon us, and they did also release a free edition, which is pretty much a demo version. It includes most of the content from the full game. It just doesn't have things like character customization, or the server browser, or Steam Workshop support. And there's also a few of the maps and campaign missions that aren't included in the free edition, but this does bring up something very important to note. What you're seeing here is actually the free edition of the game, because after having played this, I see no need to actually get the full version of the game. And that's because I've pretty much played this game before, several times. Now that's something I will talk about in detail when I get to the gameplay portion of this video, but for now, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and find out exactly how it is as an arena shooter. Does it bring back that classic feel and actually live up to its tagline of frag like it's 1999? Let's find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it does run on Unreal Engine 3, specifically the Unreal Development Kit version of it, and it generally looks pretty good. They've got some rather solid texture quality, the modeling is mostly very well done, and the environmental detail is very well done. The maps in this game look excellent, and there is actually quite a bit of color in the game, so it's not just a brown and gray and realistic kind of thing. Then there's the animations, which I would describe as functional. They are not good, they're not actually bad either, they just work and nothing more than that. Which is of course a real shame considering that the rest of the game actually looks pretty good. But then we move over to the sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier, because there's really no voice acting to speak of. I guess you could count the announcer, but that's pretty much it, other than a few grunts and that sort of thing. Then of course there's the soundtrack, which is composed entirely of electronic stuff that mostly fits in pretty well with the arena shooter theme, but there are a few tracks here and there that are particularly annoying, and if anything that's because they actually sound too modern. Which is of course to say that there are bits and pieces of certain tracks that almost sound like dubstep, and that's just enough to make the soundtrack as weak as it could be. Which is of course to say that certain tracks have moments in them that almost sound like dubstep, and I absolutely despise dubstep with a fiery passion, and it has absolutely no place whatsoever in an old school style arena shooter. Luckily the tracks in this don't actually go full on dubstep, they just have moments in them that are remarkably close, so those are annoying, but they're not anywhere near as infuriating as dubstep can get. Still had to turn down the music volume because it was actually giving me a headache though, so that's something to consider. And then of course there's the sound effects themselves, which are generally fairly decent, but there's nothing in there that's really beefy enough for my liking. In fact, a lot of the sound effects are remarkably similar to Unreal Tournament 3, and I'm pretty sure that's just because it's an Unreal Development Kit game, so there's probably a bunch of overlap between the sound effects. But while that would explain it, it doesn't really give them an excuse for it, and you end up getting a lot of deja vu if you've played Unreal Tournament 3. In fact, that's what I would use to describe nearly the entirety of the experience of playing Toxikk. It plays an awful lot like Unreal Tournament 3, only without the actual Unreal Tournament charm. And certainly without even the level of content that Unreal Tournament 3 had. Although there is a campaign mode available in the game, it's really just a series of bot matches, and the first of them is just a time trial tutorial. And while each of them does have a blurb that you can read before you actually start the level, it's really just some generic nonsense that doesn't actually do anything to tie the game together. There's really no overarching story here other than you're a soldier, so go fight and stuff. So it ultimately falls to the gameplay to bring everything up, and that's where this thing is both good and bad. It's good in that it's a solid enough arena shooter in its core mechanics. The movement system is basically just ripped from Unreal Tournament in that you have dodges that you can do by double tapping a key as well as a double jump that you can do. And the movement speed itself is very comparable to Unreal Tournament in general. Which is to say faster than most first-person shooters out there, but not quite as fast as something like Quake, for example. You have a good variety of weapons, although they're all just archetypes really. You've got your basic pistol that has a 3-round burst option. You've got a shotgun that can fire 2 barrels at once. You've got an assault rifle that can also shoot grenades. You've got an energy weapon that shoots slower moving projectiles or an instant hit beam. You've got a sniper rifle. You've got a flamethrower that can be charged up for a big ball of flame to shoot forward. You've got a basic rocket launcher that has a sort of tracking capability. And then you also have the effectively Redeemer. It's a one-shot, super powerful weapon that's only on certain maps, and you don't want to be anywhere near that thing when it goes off. But you're probably noticing something with regards to the weapons list that I've been going through here. It's a pretty straightforward weapons list. There's no surprises here. There's nothing that's really different than any other arena shooter. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the weapon types that they do have in there are tried and true, and they do work very well in this game overall, it does also mean that the weapons choices are pretty bland and uninteresting. I mean, hell, your melee weapon is a drill that doubles as a repair tool for the vehicles in the game, which are only on certain maps and certain modes, and they really don't work all that well in this particular context. Sure, they're good for getting you a bunch of kills, but other than that, they really don't serve a huge amount of purpose on the actual battlefield, particularly considering that if you're playing, for example, cell capture mode, you can't hop into one of the vehicles if you're carrying a cell, so you can't use them for a speedy escape or anything like that, and they really just end up serving as tools to kill off other players before they have a chance to do much of anything. The problem is that due to the lack of specifically anti-vehicle weapons, what you end up finding is that people use the normal rocket launcher against them, and they're surprisingly squishy when you do that. It just contributes a feeling of the vehicles themselves being underpowered compared to what the player is capable of just running around on the ground. This means that there's really not much reason to hop into one of the vehicles, and the only vehicle that you should really be using is the Streamer, which is a bike that you can spawn. It's basically the hoverboard from Unreal Tournament 3. It's the only vehicle you can use while you're carrying the cell, and that's incredibly useful because it's a fairly quick vehicle that allows you to get away from the enemy before they can annihilate you. At least that's the idea. In practice, it really depends on what the enemy team is doing and how good they are at picking you off while you're on that thing. Which does of course bring up something important to mention. This game does have a decent sized skill barrier to being able to play it, and also has a fairly high skill ceiling. The problem with that is that the player base is so small that it actually artificially lowers the skill ceiling. Which is of course why when you hop online, most of what you see is a crap ton of rocket spam and not a whole lot else. You see, while every weapon in Toxikk has its purpose, most people playing it don't really seem to understand that fact, and they just end up using whatever they've got at any given moment, unless of course they have the rocket launcher and ammunition for it, because they'll just use that for splash damage because it's a lot easier. You end up not seeing a whole lot of people switching back and forth between the various weapons in order to fit the situation at hand, and it's actually pretty annoying. Because that is one of the core tenets of an arena shooter. Every single weapon has its place, and you're supposed to be swapping between them in order to fit the situation at hand. You don't just sit there spamming rockets everywhere. Though I guess I can't blame newer players for not getting the memo, because they didn't really play these back in the day if they were even gaming at the time, so they have no idea what they're doing, and it's pretty abundantly clear when that happens. But even once you get past the fact that the weapons are pretty bland and uninteresting despite being very, very functional, and the new players are pretty much just running around like headless chickens, and the fact that the vehicles are fairly weak, you do have some pretty decent map design overall. There are a couple ones that are real stinkers, but most of them are actually fairly good deathmatch maps. Now, where you're most likely going to be seeing vehicles are on the cell capture maps, specifically the very, very large cell capture maps, because it's really only those maps that have enough space for vehicles to be somewhat effective. And all that really means is that you're playing CTF but with vehicles. So it doesn't really put much of a spin on things. In fact, all of the modes in this game are extremely basic. You have your just normal free-for-all deathmatch, you have a team deathmatch, you have capture the flag, and that's pretty much it really. Unlike in Unreal Tournament, for example, there's not a plethora of modes available. You do have some mutators you can stick in there, but the actual game modes are extremely straightforward and really quite basic when you get down to it. And you really can't escape the feeling that everything Toxikk does was done before and done better in other games. Because when you really get down to it, there's not much to Toxikk. It is an arena shooter, sure, and they did a decent enough job of trying to port the old school gameplay to modern graphics, but it's no Unreal Tournament, it's no Quake, it's just a pale imitation. And that's really the biggest problem that Toxikk has. It doesn't do anything that is truly unique. It's just regurgitating a bunch of elements from different games from back in the day, and what you end up with is a game that doesn't really have its own unique identity, and on top of that is just a very underwhelming arena shooter. I mean, really, why would I play this over the new Unreal Tournament or Quake Live? The only real answer is that the newest Unreal Tournament is unfinished, but even in its very, very unfinished alpha state, it's smoother and more old school than this. Hell, there's more advanced movement in the new Unreal Tournament than this. This is just your basic double jump dodge mechanic that you had back in the Unreal Tournament 99 and Unreal Tournament 2003 days. And there's barely any variety in the characters themselves either. They're all just suits of armor that you can lightly customize, so there's really not much point to the customization system itself. And the generally low amount of content coupled with the rather small player base, where the all-time peak is just under 1,400 players, and currently you're only getting about 500 at most. You're basically just going to have to dig through the servers to find one that actually works well and isn't laggy as hell, because lag is something that's extremely important to be able to deal with in an arena shooter, and it's something that becomes a problem particularly if you're playing the free edition and you're trying to go into the matchmaking, because it will throw you into a server halfway across the globe and suddenly you're lagging up the wazoo. So the real takeaway from Toxikk is that it's just an underwhelming experience. Everything it does was done before in other games and done way better in those games. Sure, it could get better over time, but I just can't recommend it in its current state, certainly not for the asking price that they're going for, considering that the new Unreal Tournament game is still in development, it's actually better than this, and it's free to play. So I guess if you want, you can try the free version of Toxikk and see if it's something you'd be interested in, but there's just better options out there these days. If you want to hop into an arena shooter, play Quake Live or the new Unreal Tournament. There's really not much reason to play Toxikk unless you just want to try it out and see what it's like, see what the indie communities can come up with. And in this case, it's competent. It works, you can get some decent fun out of it, but if you're the kind of person that this game is catering to begin with, the old school arena shooter fan, you're probably just gonna try to play one of the old school arena shooters and not bother with this. Ultimately, I give it a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.